There are plenty of video essays on YouTube that claim video games can't be scary, and on some levels there is truth to their arguments. With no real fear of death or consequences, horror games can build up to ultimately lackluster payoffs. Ones where a meaningless pile of ones and zeros chases you to a predetermined point of safety. These encounters are calculated and ultimately don't matter since the player, and usually the player's character, is in no harm due to the existence of checkpoints. While these arguments hold some truth, that hasn't turned off audiences from playing them. In fact, horror games are oftentimes big sellers and rake in tons of views on YouTube. Markiplier, Jacksepticeye, and even PewDiePie have to give some credit to the horror games they were playing to jumpstart their careers. So, regardless of what valid points these video essays are trying to address, the success of horror games cannot be understated. That being said, I think I found a developer whose unique style, storytelling, and gameplay can accommodate the pitfalls most regular horror games fall under, and his name is Yames. Yames found original success about 2 years back in 2018, when he entered his game Via Negativia to the How Have You Been game jam. As his earliest known piece of work under the name Yames, it garnered him some attention for its unique art style and unsettling themes. 3 months later, Lips Like Vellum would be released during the Darktober 2018 Games Jam. This is by far his most mainstream style of game, with it having been a point-and-click escape-the-room scenario. The game is horrifyingly quiet, with some of the heaviest atmosphere when the music does decide to kick in. While not gameplay intensive, it doesn't really require that to be scary. Instead, the fear is delivered through the player's actions. Nothing will happen until the player makes a move, but that also means the player has to pull the trigger, which is easier said than done. Some standout examples is this, when the player has to open this curtain, or when having to walk down this dark and lonely hallway. Lips Like Vellum is a solid experience which is not only free, but it lasts about 30 minutes at tops, giving quite the enjoyable bite-sized horror package. Discover My Body is when Yames starts to truly come into his own form. The game takes place in the not-so-far future of 2040, and with general distrust of religious factions, lonely people have begun seeking forms of community in new alternative ways. You play as a college student observing the flower blooming of an experimental psychological powerful fungus fusing with a human host. What makes this game special is not the fear involved with it. No characters are scared of what's about to happen. You aren't running away from a monster, it's just science. We, the player, may find this process scary, but to the scientists, it's just another day of work. And that mentality in and of itself is what is scary. At any point, the player can stop examining the blooming process, but progression and understanding only continues through research. And that's exactly what we do. We explore the body, scan for anomalies, and the scientist undergoing the process explains what's happening to him. You can view his body on 3 different levels to see how the fungus is changing him. On the outside, so his skin and facial features. On a skeletal level, which allows you to see new bones sprouting and old ones rotting away. And you can see how his nervous system changes and how additional brains from others who have gone through the same transition will begin to talk to him. Pretty horrifying stuff, but once you get in the zone, it really isn't all that scary. Both of you are just doing a job, someone experiencing the change for themselves, and the other observing and writing down the experience. When the jump scares happen, they are all broadcasted to the player way beforehand. There really aren't any surprises here, and that's what I find makes this game so damn scary. Waterworld takes place in another modern era, probably the same as that of Discover My Body. We play as a religious archaeologist who believes he has discovered the location for when Adam ate the apple from the forbidden tree and humanity diverged from God's pure intentions. Our character doesn't believe in the normal practices and rituals of the current institutions, and as such has decided to investigate on his own. The game takes place in a submerged laboratory where we go out onto the ocean floor and find artifacts and catch fish for study. The player travels in a small, dimly lit area where you must manually click every movement. You can sift through the sand and throw nets at fish in order to catch them. There's also an oxygen tank that slowly decreases in level with time, though you can always just go back to your lab and refill it. The more fascinating aspects of this game are the subjects that you discover, with there being an emphasis on the weird influences of time. All these artifacts and specimens seem to have come from a different time period. The game follows this gameplay loop of discovering and researching until this moment. What follows is an absolutely gut-wrenching walkthrough, complete darkness, until you find this. This was a shock for me. In a matter of seconds, the game's tone changed completely. Don't get me wrong, this dark passageway by no means was comfortable before, but there were no signs of a threat. And the rest of the game has the haunting atmosphere of never knowing when something else will come out of the dark. Yet despite everything that just happened, our character decides he needs to know the truth and continues to capture more subjects despite what common sense would tell us all to do. At this point, I wouldn't blame you if you alt-tabbed out of this part of the game. Thalassophobia is a real thing that I think most of us would suffer, given the extreme circumstances the game presents us. But for those of you who were brave enough to continue, events quickly change for better or worse, depending on how you see it. We are visited by these things, which simply tell us Waterworld. And we then discover that we ourselves are going through a transition. It doesn't hurt from what we know, but our character wants to feed and to return to God, as they say in their own words. Waterworld focuses much more on ideas, while our character has an understanding of what's happening. For example, we know that this is supposed to be an angel, and we know this red coral is partially to blame for these transformations. There's still an air of mystery, though, surrounding this world. What does God look like? Is God just the planet? Was that squid thing really an angel? And what the hell is that massive red circle at the end of the game? These questions will probably never be answered, or just maybe, since Yames has announced several new projects, including direct sequel to Lips Like Vellum and a planned full game for Discover Our Bodies. Yames does a few things exceptionally well. One is the fact that his horror games are about exploring the subject at hand rather than running away from it. This idea of running away from things is often what sells other horror games short. For example, focal points in more common horror games is the build-up to a monster or alien, but then the tension is often released when a player is chased and loses. That encounter no longer instills fear into the player since we know what's going to happen next. But in Yames games, we embrace that fear. In fact, we're often searching for it. In Via Negativia, we are told that God will take our body parts in exchange for nothing, yet we still walk towards it expecting our fate. Lips of Vellum presents an unclear situation that could very well harm the player, yet we still pick that path, seeing as it's the best chance of us escaping our room. Discover My Body literally has you searching for the horror in question in the name of scientific discovery, and of course in Waterworld we continue our search for the origin of man, despite being warned and seeing a horrifying angel with our own eyes. Yames doesn't force us to run from a monster, become subject to some form of brutal torture, nor are we being stalked by something. The horror is a byproduct of human curiosity, and if you don't agree with me, well, nothing was stopping you, the player, from exiting the game whenever you felt too uncomfortable to.